So I think there is nothing best than to just give you a warm welcome, and please everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Harry Hagopian.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is not just something that everybody says when they're invited to speak, but it's a pleasure for me to be here for the very simple reason that I've only had one association and one conference with the Armenian Institute, and that goes back so many years that I can't even remember the year that we did that, but that was with Dr. Suzanne as well, organizing it at the time, and we spoke about the Israel-Palestine situation. And if I think about the Israel-Palestine situation when I spoke then, and when I think about it when I speak now, I realize that instead of things getting better, things have gone remarkably south, remarkably worse over many, many aspects. So I'll start by doing my usual Armenian equivalent to an Orbi et Orbi by thanking everybody and particularly thanking the two people with whom I've had some association during the organization of this event, and that is Erica and Mariana. And I would also like to give a shout here to ARQ, the Armenian Quarter young men and women in Jerusalem, who at the moment are in a tent sitting next to the seminary in order to try and protect that little turf from any possible attack. To start, I'm going to go back to the 1990s. I was involved, as Juan mentioned briefly, I was involved with the track 2 negotiations during the Oslo period. What that meant was that the Palestinians and the Israelis were negotiating during the heyday when people thought that peace was possible. And I was headhunted to go back to Jerusalem in order to represent the brief of all the churches of Jerusalem, in order to try and defend or protect or talk about their interests in the file that was being discussed over Jerusalem. So I ended up working with what we call in Jerusalem the 13 traditional churches, amongst which are the 3 patriarchates, the top one being the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, then the Armenian Patriarchate, and thirdly, the Latin Rite Catholic Patriarchate. And then there are 10 bishoprics of the various churches there as well. And during this time, I had the pleasure of working closely with His Beatitude Torkom II, who was involved in those negotiations, albeit, for those of you who know him would know what I mean, albeit a little bit remotely. So during those negotiations that we had, the culmination of sorts was when we had a document and when President Clinton, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and Chairman Yasser Arafat went to Camp David in order to go into a retreat and try and hammer out a solution. What would each side accept in terms of compromises to try and find a way out of the very problematic issues of Jerusalem. And as I was representing the churches and I was involved in those political discussions, I realized that the aim of this meeting, in part, was to try and convince Chairman Yasser Arafat to sign on a piece of paper which said that in the old city, which had 4 quarters, the Christian and Muslim quarters would be under Palestinian jurisdiction, but not under their legal jurisdiction, the practical jurisdiction, de facto, not de jure, whereas the Armenian and Jewish quarters would be under both the de jure and de facto jurisdiction of Israel. And I, for one, immediately thought that that doesn't work. And that doesn't work for a whole variety of reasons. If we come down the ladder a bit from the hefty reasons, political, cultural, societal, and we look at the practical aspects of that tiny little old city, you would realize that somebody living in the Armenian Quarter might be working in the Muslim Quarter. Somebody in the Christian Quarter might do something else in one of the other quarters. So to try and separate this, particularly by doing a different legal divisions between those two and those two, wouldn't have worked at all. It would have been a practical mess, and politically, it would have been unacceptable to the Armenians to be parceled with the Israeli government, whilst the Christian and Muslim Palestinian sectors or quarters were with the Palestinian Authority at the time, when the authority had some meaning. So I spoke with two patriarchs who basically had my back during those meetings, and those were the Latin Rite Patriarch and the Armenian Patriarch. And I told them, listen, this is wrong. This shouldn't happen, and we should object. And by we, I don't mean me or the Armenians, I mean all the Christians of the Holy Land. And so, to cut a long story short, I was asked to draft a letter in the name of all 13 patriarchs, archbishops, and bishops, representing the Christians of the Holy Land. And by Holy Land, we mean, for the purposes of this document, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. I drafted that letter, carried it with me to Camp David in order to submit it to the 3 summiteers. And I left it there. I was allowed to go to the garden, but not beyond the garden. And then the meeting, as you might remember, those of you who followed this, the meeting was not a success. It failed. And it was one of the coffins in the nail, one of the nails in the coffin of the Oslo process, because Arafat said, no, I don't agree to this. And when Arafat said, no, I don't agree to this, Ehud Barak said, I don't agree to this. And Clinton was pretty much left with no fig leaf. So when Arafat came out, and this is all archived in the New York Times, so it's not me embroidering the story. When Arafat came out, a New York Times journalist said, Mr. Chairman, why did you say no? And he turned to them and he said, did you not know that my name is not Yasser Arafat? My name is Yasser Arafatian. And that was, those of us who knew Arafat knew that he had a very distinctive sense of humor because of the many years that he'd spent growing up in Cairo in Egypt. And Egyptians have that very nice sense of humor. So that basically was the end of that story, and he sort of said it beautifully. Now, why do I start with this story? I start with this story for a very simple reason, to underline to you the importance of the Armenian Quarter to Armenians, but also to non-Armenians. And over the years, there have been a whole community of creative men and women who, to be honest with you, are out of proportion to their numbers. You've got a composer, Orhan Durian. You've got a philosopher, Haik Khachadurian. You've got a theologian, Abraham Tarian. You've got now craftsmen, craftswomen, you've got people of science, people of politics. And in a sense, I will tie this in with another Oslo-related story, basically, which is as follows. During those meetings, there were many people who were spokespersons on what was happening, because there was something happening every day with the process. Then things looked decidedly better than they do today. There were 4 Armenians who held key positions in Jerusalem in various different areas. Top of those 4 was Manuel Hassasian, who was responsible with, at the time, somebody called Faisal Husseini on the Jerusalem brief. That was his brief at Orient House, the Jerusalem brief. The second person was the late Albert Aghazarian, who used to be a lecturer at Birzeit University and who later accompanied Hanan Ashrawi to the first of the conferences that we held there, the Madrid conference. Then there was Kevort, known more as George Hintlian, who basically lives within the Patriarchate and who was responsible for the media. And then there was yours truly, moi, doing the legal and political aspects of the negotiations during Oslo. So the reason I'm saying this is not because, and I'm not that kind of person, those who know me know that well enough, to brag about, oh, I'm an Armenian, there is nothing better than an Armenian. No, we're ordinary people. But the reason I'm saying this is because in a tiny community, 4 Armenians, totally disproportionate to their numbers, were actually key holders of different briefs within this period in the Palestinian-Israeli context. So you have those Armenians. There were roughly around, probably at their heyday, there were roughly about 25,000. Now there are roughly about 3,000 remaining. The sense of migration has been incredible. And some of that migration has been, yes, because of political reasons, but some of it has been definitely because of economic reasons. And the people who live, the Armenians who live in Jerusalem, either live in the old city, the Karakatis, those who live in the Patriarchate itself, the Vanketsis, and those who live in the suburbs outside of Jerusalem, or what is known as outside the walls. There are, of course, other Armenians who live in 1948 Israel and 1967 Israel. So you have people living in Yafo, in Jaffa, and people living also in Bethlehem. Then, if I look at the history, and by any stretch of the imagination, I'm not a historian, so please don't bother asking me history questions. But if I look at some of what has been written about the history of the region, you can see that the Armenians are not newcomers to the area. In fact, most people would say that Armenians started somewhere around the 4th century. And then they built on it, and then they had the wave or the influx of Armenians who came during the Armenian genocide. And interestingly enough, during the Armenian genocide, Muslims opened their homes for the Armenians to live with them, just as today, Lebanese Christians, despite the antagonisms in Lebanon between this and that and the other, are opening their doors for Muslims from the south, particularly the Shia community, to come up to Beirut to flee the pounding that is happening there. But if I want to go a little bit more, and I just leave it there for you historians, you can mull over it. What I'm saying, I told Juan, I don't lecture in these places. I just provide seeds for thought, and then you can develop on them. There is even written material that there was an Armenian community in the 55 BC, before Christ. And that was during the time of one of the greatest Armenian kings, King Tigran the Great, or King Tigranes II. So in a sense, Armenians are not there as interlopers or newcomers. They are there as people who have lived there and have a right to be there and to share some of the joys and sadnesses of being in Jerusalem. So in that little tiny area we call the Armenian Quarter, you have got St. James, the convent, Surpagop. You've got the convent of Holy Archangels, Reștagabed. You've got Surp Doros. You've got the Gulbenkian Library. And I've been there. I've seen the development and refurbishment that has taken place. 100,000 books are in that library. That is not to be sniffed at. Then you also have artifacts. You have the Mardigyan Museum or Tankaran, including actually a very interesting Byzantine era mosaic that was found in the Christian quarter and then was taken and now is in the Armenian Museum. It came from, those of you who know a bit about Jerusalem, from Musrara, which is next to Damascus Gate. So in a sense, this is what has happened. And there is a person whom some of you might have met or heard of, no relation to me, Arthur Hagopian, who used to be in Jerusalem, who used to be there when I was consultant with the Turkon Badriark. He is now in Australia. And Arthur is now creating a website. He's been working at it for donkey's years, a website that provides a portal to include the domars, the hatches, the matches, and the dispatches of the Patriarchate from 1840 to our present times. So let me speed forward and then come to the Ottoman rule. During the Ottoman rule, the churches, which is nothing new, were bickering with each other. Each one wants its own privileges, its own rights. No, I can go and pray there in the Holy Sepulchre. No, this is where I go in first into the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And the three bickerers are the three ones who have the biggest amount of property there. And that is largely the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, and the Franciscans or the Latin Rite Catholics. And therefore, at that time, in order to try and provide some sort of system for these people to work around, the Ottoman rulers then created what was known as the status quo. And the status quo would apply to 9 shared sites in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem. This was regulated in 1854. And it became customary international law because nobody would legislate it in 1878. And what means that since then until today, when you talk to the churches about what are their rights, their privileges, and their duties in those various sites, including the 2 key ones, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem, it is there in that status quo agreement. And when there are political rows between Israel and the churches or amongst the churches themselves, when they squabble, you always go back to that and see what has happened. And one of the things, one of the throwbacks of the status quo agreement, as it's known today to everyone who works with it, is that when a new patriarch is elected, the 3 leaders of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan should issue their firmans, their edicts, saying we approve of this patriarch being the patriarch of this community or that community. So that applies to the Greeks, that applies to the Armenians, and that applies to the Catholics, because they are the 3 patriarchates. The others are Anglican, Lutheran, Greek Catholic, whatever, Armenian Catholic, who are basically look elsewhere for their rights. So if you want anything more about the history or anything more about how all this came together or developed, then I would suggest one name to you, and you can use it in your search engine and find it. His name is Bedros Dermatosyan. Bedros Dermatosyan is at the University of Nebraska and Lincoln. And he is somebody who has written a lot about these territories. He is a Jerusalemite himself, and he is a Vanketzi. And he wrote about all these issues in terms of rights and duties. And one of the things he would tell you, I'm sure, I haven't read his books, is that the Armenian Patriarchate came into being sometime in the beginning, early 14th century. They created the Brotherhood of St. James. And I'm putting all these facts to you because this is a very amorphous title. It gives me license to say anything and nothing. But I'm going then to bring it to the what's happening at the Armenian Quarter today. And what happens is that the Brotherhood of St. James is basically the parliament of the Patriarch who decides on the various rules and regulations of the parliament. And of course, as I said earlier, 25,000 to 3,000, the biggest drops in demographic reality came in 1948 and in 1967, because incidentally, a lot of Armenians also became refugees in 1948 upon the creation of the State of Israel. And this is not theory for me. This for me is practical because my family was one of those families living in one of the two rich neighborhoods of Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. My mother was a 13-year-old girl at the time living with her parents, my maternal grandparents, and they were literally given 6 hours to pack and go. So when people start telling me that, oh, you know what? Nobody told them to go. They just up and went. That's absolute balderdash because they were forced to go. So my grandparents, who actually fled the Armenian genocide and lost everything there, came and installed themselves. And my grandfather had a very lucrative business in West Jerusalem, in Talpiot, in Talbiye, and he lost everything as well. And then he went from there, he fled. He was one of the 750,000 Palestinian refugees who fled upon the creation of the State of Israel, which is why in Hebrew, it's the Yom HaMatzmaut, the Independence Day, and for the Arabs, it's Yom al-Nakba, the Catastrophe Day. So that is what happened. And he went to Beirut with his family, stayed in Beirut for 3 years. Beirut was a very welcoming place then, and then ended up coming into Jordan, where I was born and stayed until the age of 13, when I went to France and grew up and lived there and went to school there. So this is basically where we are. And when the 1967 war happened and the occupation took place of East Jerusalem, what was Jordanian Arab Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, plus other bits from Syria and Egypt, it was a very interesting thing that happened there, which to me also points to the fallacies that sometimes are said under the clothing of knowledge. When that happened, the Minister of Defense was Moshe Dayan, the one with the one patch. Moshe Dayan thought, you know what? These Armenians, they would never like to mingle with the Arabs. So let's go and try and win them over to have that community with us against the Palestinians. And there are many, many stories of him and the then Patriarch Yerishe Derderian sitting and playing poker and drinking whiskey and having those discussions. And it didn't work because the community did not go with that. The community felt culturally inculturated within the Palestinian society. Then they tried to ask the Christians, a larger community, would you be willing to come along with them? And what do you want to do with them? They're all terrorists anyway. It didn't work either. And therefore, what happened is that the whole attempt of divide et impera, to divide and rule, didn't work. And this is why when people start telling me, oh yes, but what about the Armenians? They're Armenians, they're not Arabs, they're Armenians, they're not Palestinians. Yes, they're not Palestinians, they're not Arabs, they're Armenians. Their identity is Armenian. Their faith is Christian. Their cultural heritage and history is Arab-Palestinian. Simple as that. And that applies to 90% of the people. There are always others who would say, no, 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 we're an exception. And what we have seen over the years, and you must have heard this, and people who lived there or know of the place would have said so, is that the scuffles, the spitting at the priests, the bishops, the churches, when you have an Orthodox Jew passing in front of the Armenian Quarter to go to the Jewish Quarter, and that's the trick during Arafat's time. Why did they want to put the Armenian and the Jewish quarters together? Because it's a shortcut to go straight to the Kotel, to the Wailing Wall, to the wall. So when people sort of say to me, oh, no, 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 this is not true, this is very, very true. The community has been and has stayed homogeneous. And when people point to me by saying, oh, but look in Iraq, they're eating each other out. When you talk about the people elsewhere in Lebanon, I say to them, yes, but the saving grace of Palestinians, be they Christian or Muslim, is that they have a common enemy. And that common enemy is what welds them together rather than divides them. So all this now takes you through the case. But, and this is my PR, if you want to follow any of this a little bit more with maps and things, this is the book that Juan talked to you about, The Armenian Church in the Holy Land, which I published in 2017. And in it, it's a small one because I don't think people have the attention these days to read for very long. I mean, when The Guardian says long read, people run away. So this has a lot in it that might interest you. You can find it on my website. You can find it on Google. You can find it with Ecclesia publishers who publish this book. Now, we come to the last bit, which is known as the Cow's Garden, which in Armenian is Goberu Bardez. I always think it's a very funny way of describing that Armenians are fighting over cows. But the Cow's Garden, and here, if you wouldn't mind terribly, I did this because I did this, and he knows, because that's how this talk took place. I did this at Hagazian University in Beirut, this talk, and I said there what I'm going to say here. The case is sub judice. In other words, it is still in litigation. And therefore, there are things I cannot say because I'm also part of the legal counsel, and therefore I cannot tell you what is happening in the details, but I can give you an idea of where the story started. So, the story started when suddenly, was it 2 years ago or whatever, suddenly it became known, 2 years, 3 years ago, when it suddenly became known that, guess what? The patriarch has leased a whole chunk of the Armenian quarter to an Australian Jew. Fine. Now, the community knew nothing of this. But then again, it doesn't surprise me because the clerics and the lay people hardly ever talk to each other. So what are we talking about? People immediately, the antennae went up because Armenians can be, well, you know this, can be nationalistic, patriotic, quite vehement with their ideas. And they said, what in the dickens is this? And to cut it short, it became clear that conjecture more than evidence, because nobody had seen the lease document. that the patriarch and his director of real estates had actually entered into an agreement with some Israeli, he is Israeli, he's got an Israeli passport as well, and an Australian Jew to lease out 25% of the Armenian Quarter, which if you close your eyes, those who've been, and you're going past Jaffa Gate, Newgate, into the Armenian Quarter, you pass under a tunnel where there was what we call the bulgurji, who used to sell sackfuls of Armenian bulgur. You would go, cracked wheat, James. You would go across the tunnel, and then on the right is the seminary, it's the kitchen, it's the school. That area, 25% of that was going to be leased out for 99 years for the most ridiculous amount of money, given that that area is one of the highest prime real estates in Jerusalem. And knowing how Israeli religious, Orthodox, Oriental Jews want to get anything they can grab in order to gradually Judaize Jerusalem and get rid of the Christians and the Muslims, people were sort of like, what? The what went on for a very long time because the patriarch refused to share with anybody that lease document to show what is happening. So I was receiving calls as somebody who was born there and who would work with Torkom, would practice law, who'd done the Middle East Council of Churches there. Please, Harry, come, you've been to the High Court, you speak Hebrew, come and do something. Well, do what? What can I do when I don't even have a clue what the details are? And the patriarch is a new patriarch. He's not Torkom. Torkom is dead. With Torkom, it would have been easy. But with this new one, Norhan, I didn't really know him. What am I going to say? Hi, I'm Harry. I'd like to see the document. He'll tell me bugger off. So how can I deal with it? I told them it's not possible. But to cut a long story short, you know, a little drop here, a little snippet of information there, it became clear that yes, there had been such a thing that had happened. And the patriarch, because when you look at the pyramid of a company, you know how this works. The patriarch said, I didn't know about it. It's the director of the real estate. And the man was kicked out of Jerusalem in the most ignominious of manners, where he was running away with a big bag. I would have loved to know what's in that bag. With a big bag into a car to go to Ben Gurion, to the airport, from where he flew to Turkey, and from Turkey, he went to the United States. And of course, that's not the end of it. Okay, so what about the 25%? So it became quite clear that the 25% had been leased out for 99 years. And incidentally, not only had it been leased out, but the patriarch doesn't have the right legally to lease out something for 99 years without the approval of the St. James Brotherhood, the people I told you about at the beginning. And that had not happened. So legally, it's on dodgy ground. But let's forget that, because Armenians have this tendency of irarug kotsenk. The thing that happened there was that it was illegal. It was very dangerous to get 25% of that out and to build a huge hotel, which I know that hotel was going to be for Israeli religious people. What about the Armenians who for centuries, 2,000 people, there is a very, I won't say it in Arabic, there is an expression which says that for those few people, you have one of the four quarters of Jerusalem. Instead of clutching to it, instead of, fine, crowdfund, go and get money if you're running out of money. Do anything, but don't just give it out. So people, that is where, when I said at the beginning, a shout out to the ARQ, the young people in Jerusalem who are in tents and trying to protect and guard that place. What happened is that this little group of community-minded people was set up, and they're the ones who are trying now to sit there. But the story developed. The story developed because it then became clear that the sale was not to that Australian Jew. The sale was made through these people to an organization called Ateret Kohanim. Ateret Kohanim is one of the most radical Jewish organizations in Jerusalem and across Israel, which go picking houses everywhere, and they basically flood you with money. If you have a little hovel, literally a hovel, in the middle of old city of Jerusalem, they pay you 50 times what you would get for that hovel, just so they get in there, and they put the Israeli flag, and they say, this is our city, it is not your city. When that happened, the situation changed. I still hadn't seen the lease, but they called me, the clubs, the Gusak Tuchuns, and the people there. Some of the priests who are not happy with what is happening, they call you, but they say, let's do it encrypted so nobody knows. And we talked to them, and I told them, you know what, guys, this changes legally the facts on the ground, because leasing this land to this Australian Jew, Uksana, the name of the company, is one thing, but for that person to be a cover for another organization, which is putrid in the real sense of the word, that is fraud. And if that is what happened, you can go to court and you can ask for the dissolution or the cancellation of the lease. And now, and I come to the end, and now they had a kermes, by the way, a couple of days ago, these young people, for the 33rd anniversary of the independence of Armenia. What is happening now, the cases, there are two cases. One submitted by the Armenian Patriarch, one by those people. It's a, what do you call this? When all people come together in one claim. Anyway, they've gone to court to try and cancel, annul that document. And of course, the court is not independent. So it is pushing and pulling, and at the moment, no decision has yet been taken. So it's all hanging in the air to see how it will go. I'll just add a couple of points here, and then I'm coming to the end. Where is Juan? I'm coming. He got bored. I'll add a couple of points. People said to me, and I spoke with a couple of people who used to be primates here in London, and others whom I know from New York and other bishops. They said, look, can we do something at Echmiadzin? No, you can't do anything at Echmiadzin if Jerusalem doesn't want to do it. Why? Because there are 4 C's to the Armenian church. The top one is Echmiadzin. The second one is Cilicia in Lebanon, in Antelias. The third one is Jerusalem. And the fourth one is Constantinople or Istanbul. 3 and 4 are what we call, in ecumenical terms, they are autocephalous. It means they have their own administration. They are not bound by the directions of the Vehapar in Echmiadzin or the Vehapar in Anteliat. They can say whatever they want. It won't make a difference if they don't want to listen to them. Then the churches of Jerusalem, after this fraud was discovered, and they could say something, because at the beginning they were also like, what can you say when you know what's happening? I mean, how can you say, oh, this is okay? They made statements, they tried to appeal, etc., etc. But at the moment, it's still very much in in court. And recently, they got in touch with me, the what do you call this? What's the head of a club? Yeah, the president of one of the clubs in Jerusalem. There are 2, 3 main clubs. Called me, he said, Harry, what can you say? And I said, listen, I can't say anything more now that I didn't say earlier, but I'll just give you one example which applies to Jerusalem, and it, in my opinion, humbly applies to many Armenians in many parts of the world. I said to him, the aphorism, the saying goes, follow your heart, but take your brain with you. That doesn't happen always. Thank you. Thank you. I hope I tried to share some food for thought with you, and that I tried to do it in such a way that doesn't put you all to sleep. And I can see that even my friend there, Steve, did not doze off. So that means I was doing something right. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone online as well.